I was just gonna
Fuck.
bring that up. Apparently, that's like the number one trending thing in politics on Twitter right now. Some garbage.
Teases 20. He teases it.
Yeah, teased it, but it sounds like
Just giving it a little jerky jerk.
he might be doing it just to stir up his donor base to get him stuff. Send him a little
Like,
bit more money through the Cash App.
It just needs to eat more McDicks and dropped out of cardiac arrest or something.
no, he needs to have long-term complications from COVID. Long COVID kills him.
Yeah, that'd be so perfect.
But imagine the conspiracies that of long COVID kills Trump.
Oh my
Oh
god.
man,
It would
It would be
actually just rip apart Trumpistan. It would be a disaster.
uh, the world isn't ready for something that fantastic.
It'd be so. It would be.
Like, yeah, JFK would be nothing compared to Trump dying of COVID.
Oh, that'd be beautiful. It'd just be so funny if it was determined cause of death. Like I don't know what they'll probably have like post COVID some sort of syndrome thing that they'll come up with these days after.
Yeah.
And then in like 2022 he dies of that. Trump's heart has, due to long COVID syndrome has failed and he's now dead. It's all the right wingers reading about how it's fake news and he was assassinated.
It would just turn out to be the grandest conspiratorial theory of all time.
How can he die of something that's not real?
Exactly. It's just like Epstein.
It would be just down in South America with Biggie and Tupac.
And Hitler.
Such a terrible time.
All of them just hanging out.
So much narcissism in one room.
Absolutely. You just off yourself within 3 minutes. Alrighty, and we're live. So, the topic today is green energy. We kind of came to this topic by just the general milieu of ideas around green energy, especially in the province.
Whoa, give us some credit. We're totally original on this one. We picked it up before anyone else.
Yeah, exactly.
We're bleeding edge of topics.
We're the only podcast in the history of podcasting to report on this. I guess the general impetus for the idea is just, especially in the circles that we run in, you see a lot of people talking about solar energy, green energy, but particular solar and wind being the big thing, the thing to solve all the problems of climate change. Especially when Biden came in, he was pushing a lot of climate change policies right off the bat. So we wanted to take a look at some of the claims and the viability of green energy, see how viable it actually is, and also take a look at some of the other related items around it. So Hubbard, do you want to kick it off with your thoughts first?
Yeah, sure. Kind of looked into this a little bit, so I don't think my thoughts before were hopefully a little bit informed. One of the things you hear about a lot is obviously green energy, renewables. The cost is rapidly declining. So especially something like solar, you hear about all the time. Like solar is getting more efficient. It's getting way, way better, and because it's being produced at a bigger and bigger scale and with better and better processes, it's getting just insanely cheaper, insanely quickly. So that is one thing I kind of had heard lots about. I hopefully will clear up how much that is actually happening, but obviously the problem with something like solar and wind, it's not really hard to figure out if you think about them at a basic level. The sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, so there's going to be consistency issues, and that's a huge problem that you just have to solve somehow, right? Like there's no way around it. You have to have something in place unless you want to basically go back to a unreliable third world power grid where you're having to brown out half the time. You have to have
So
something to
California.
mitigate. Yeah, like you have to have something to mitigate the, what happens when, you just get a dead streak of really low wind, the 1 in 100 streak of low wind. So whatever that may be, you need to figure that's something that has to be solved. I guess being from BC in Canada, we're like BC is really lucky because we have hydro. So hydro is just honestly the best power source if you have the ability to have it. It seems, at least that's what my thoughts going into this was. This hydro is dreamy because it is clean, like no emissions. It's extremely reliable because and responsive. It's both of those things because obviously the water always does flow unless you have like a river drought, but most of the rivers you're going to be damming aren't going to have the flow issue. And you have a reservoir that you can pump through more or less water depending on your peak time. If you have a peak power time in the evening, you're just running through more water, and then in the night you can ease off on the flow. So it has self-contained, it has storage built in, super responsive, super consistent, and clean. So I don't know, like hydro, if you can build it, it just seems like a no-brainer. And then the only other thing that I thought going into this was like nuclear has a lot of similarities to hydro, in the sense that it's clean. It doesn't produce any hydrocarbon or any CO2 emissions or anything like that. Obviously, you have nuclear waste, which is another issue. But aside from that, it's very similar to hydro, where it's responsive. You can crank up the nuclear plant. As far as I know, you can crank it up or down in response to power demand, and it's very consistent. No issues there. So, but that's about it.
All right, Price. How about you?
Yeah, my predominant thought from knowledge that I have is that nuclear is by far the best option and horribly underrated, and the public interest is not there because of a few overblown accidents that happened years ago. Like, who even remembers Fukushima? But basically, nuclear is the reasonable option, and people discount it. So we're looking at other green options that people are more interested in. And solar, I think, from what I've researched casually before this, is the best in the currently publicly acceptable options of sustainable energy. And that's just getting mind-blowingly better. Like 90% decrease in cost in the last 10 years, kind of better. Wind is like not bad. I mean, it's been around for quite a while as pretty much the only kid on the block, like 20 years ago, for actually making good renewable energy because solar was so much more expensive. But it's not had anywhere near the gains of solar. And I believe, from what I've read in the past, that many places with good wind resources have already built up all of those wind resources into wind farms. So there's not the room for expansion that there is with solar. Hydro's as dreamy as it sounds. Hydrogen is something that I've always kind of had in the back of my mind, and you don't see talked about in public discourse very often. So I wanted to research more on that because that's another one that you can make hydrogen with renewable energy, so it can be a renewable store of energy rather than being made as it is now predominantly with natural gas.
Well, you want to create water as a byproduct and drown us all?
Oh, that's another one I knew before this.
You're solving climate change by then also making the same problem.
Yeah, you throw a hydrogen plant in Cape Town, and all of a sudden you've solved the drought and you're making electricity. It's a win-win. Yeah, so I think the ways I knew that things were being dealt with was either by disincentivizing dirty energy through taxes or other carbon limits, and then incentivizing green energy. And the one that intuitively I think is the best is the cap and trade system, where a polluting company has to buy their carbon credits so that they can pollute off of renewable companies that create carbon credits, so that it naturally promotes the production of renewables and generates a market without government interference or centralization. And is sort of, that's a way to price in the negative climate effects caused by pollution without kind of brute forcing it from a government mandate aspect.
And just to add to that, the other nice thing about cap and trade is like presumably the pollution or the carbon pollution is going to be then used by the company that is creating the most value, because clearly the one that can create the most value with the pollution is going to be willing to pay the most for it, essentially, right? So that's another reason people like cap and trade, because it allows a market for it, so that presumably the places that are able to create the most value for the economy get to do the pollution, and the ones that aren't producing much value for the economy are not going to have any incentive to buy it, and will just have to stop polluting, essentially.
And so that's basically what I understood about the current state of the green economy.
Alrighty. For me, pretty much, actually, my thoughts on nuclear, very similar to Price's. One of the other things I had a little bit of knowledge about going in, I knew that there's quite a bit of subsidies through the forms of tax breaks and some other things done by various governments, particularly the US, for fossil fuels. So one of the things that I thought of there is there probably needs to be a pretty big shift in just the way that governments handle those companies, just to at least to level the playing field a little bit more. I had also seen that the cost of a lot of these renewable energy sources have gone down massively in the last like 10-20 years, but it would be even more competitive potentially if those subsidies didn't exist. So that would be one of the probably the only thing that I thought of that was a little bit different than what you guys have already talked about. So I think we can wrap up our thoughts there. If anybody has anything else, are you guys good?
Yeah, that's good for the intro, I'd say.
Yeah, that's plenty.
Okay. All right, and then so I think we can just jump right into like the renewable sources of energy, and I guess like pros and cons, and like their features and whatnot. Hubbard, do you want to kick us off again there?
Well, I think one thing to introduce before we go into all that is just like a big component of all this is obviously cost. You know, I mean, as much as many people who push renewables would just assume or will state it, no matter what the cost, we should go into it. Obviously, market forces are going to be needed to push in, renewables to actually be adopted. So just like talking about how governments and also even private industry and stuff value renewables and energy in general, we should probably just introduce that. So one measure that is consistently used is levelized cost of energy, which is basically they take the net present value, the net present value of the total costs for a particular energy generation project, and then they just divide it by the total energy produced. So you basically get cost per whatever unit of energy you want to use, kilowatt, megawatt, whatever. So then you can actually compare close enough to apples between different projects proposed in terms of their cost. One issue, obviously, is there's a lot of assumptions that goes into levelized costs. Like your discount rate is obviously going to be an estimate. Your years of useful life, your maintenance costs in the future. So there's all sorts of assumed variables that are going to make for imperfect comparison. But it is a decent way to get a handle on kind of the magnitude of costs and whether or not something makes sense. The other interesting measure that I did see talked about less is levelized avoided cost of energy. And that's essentially like that one's a little more complicated, but it's also the net present value of the power that would be generated, basically the revenue generated from power in a specific locale. and divided by the total power. So it's essentially, if you think about the levelized cost of energy as the standardized cost measurement, they call it LACE, the levelized avoided cost of energy, is the benefit, the revenue, the normalized revenue of the power that would be coming in. So basically what you can do from there is you can compare the LACE to the LCOE, the levelized cost, and if the LACE is larger than the levelized cost, you know that you're in a positive scenario where that project would make sense in that particular locale. So that gives you an idea of economic feasibility of a project. And again, there's a whole bunch of assumptions baked into those different measures, but it does give you a place to start with saying, like, okay, if we did build a wind farm here, like, would this be even in the ballpark of economically viable as a project, which is a necessary thing to start thinking about if we're going to be replacing large chunks of our power generation.
And I think the LACE, I believe that's what I ran into under various names. That is really important in renewables because that's where it will reflect the decreasing value of renewables as you increase the number of renewables in a grid. Basically, the idea being that when you have a bunch of solar panels or wind turbines and the conditions are right for them to generate a lot of electricity, that the more you have, the more electricity is generated by them, which drives down the cost of electricity in that grid while they're generating at peak amounts, and therefore means that they're actually making less money. Like a wind turbine will make less money if it's the 1 millionth wind turbine than if it was the first wind turbine, because it's now competing with a million other wind turbines that are all producing electricity at the same time in the same conditions.
Yeah, right? That's a good point. And I mean, we'll run into that issue again when we do go deeper into renewables. Wind and solar have that particular feature of they generate energy at a specific time. They're not responsive or consistent, right? So that's definitely an issue. And if you were looking into it, you'd have to make sure that they are taking those calculations. But LACE will tend to look at those issues as well. So it is a good measure for sure. I guess I don't know if you guys have anything else, but yeah. So if you actually look at the different sources of power and their costs, because there's so many baked in estimates and variables, different sources have different estimates of which ones are cheaper. But it is there's a few obvious takeaways. One is that wind and solar have gotten a lot cheaper over the last even decade, especially, which is, not a very long time scale for, I think, Price, you had some specific numbers on that, but like it has dramatically declined in cost. And
well, I think the specific number, and it does depend on what country you're in, because China makes by far the cheapest solar panels in the world because their government effectively stepped in and fronted a bunch of capital costs for the factories that make the solar panels. So they're considered anti-competitive by a lot of the other world's governments, and therefore most countries outside of China pay more than China does. So a lot of the super optimistic stuff on solar panels comes out of China, and that's where you see about a 90% drop in cost of solar panels in 10 years.
So my question, though, would be, factoring in that upfront cost that got floated to them by the government, how close would it be to the rest of the world with, like, in terms of the 90% drop? Like, does that kind of hold true against all the other nations, or is it, like, other places have only really got 50% drops?
Well, like Canada and the US, from what I understand, would be around like an 80% price decrease.
So it's still pretty busted,
right? Like it's the technology has just come leaps and bounds, but China is like another step ahead of the rest of the world in this regard.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't have anything to add on there, so we can carry on with the rest of it unless you guys got anything else on that.
Well, the big thing I think is the storage. That's what we haven't talked about yet, right? For
a couple of things we haven't talked about, right? So obviously, costs are coming down for wind and solar. That's true. They are becoming competitive with. It seems consistent. Again, the sources are all different, but one consistent thing that does seem to pop out is advanced natural gas processes seem to be the cheapest everywhere you look. It's the cheapest way to make energy right now. And then another really cheap way to make,
for other people who might not know that's like the shale reserves in the States and in Canada and Russia.
It's part of them.
Yeah.
Natural gas is a byproduct of oil extraction.
Yeah.
Back in the good old days, in the mid 1900s, the flares that you'd see above any oil well were flaring off natural gas because it was just considered a garbage byproduct that nobody wanted. And now we actually burn it for energy. So that's an improvement.
Yeah, just rather than torching it.
Yeah, so it's definitely the cheapest, it seems. And then wind and solar are becoming more and more competitive with that level of cost. Another thing to consider is like hydro and say nuclear are also very cheap in terms of continued operations. So if you don't have to build a new nuclear plant, or you don't have to build a new hydro dam, just to keep them operating into the future is very cheap. They have low cost of operation. So those seems to be the cheapest kind of options. But the one thing we already mentioned is because of wind and solar's inability to respond to peak times and just kind of make power, like just to compare to a natural gas plant, right? A natural gas plant can crank up or down its energy generation by just slamming more fuel in. It's really, really responsive to demand, whereas wind and solar are not at all responsive. It's if the sun's shining or the wind's blowing, it's going to be making power. If not, it's not. That's a fact.
There can be problems where you don't have enough natural gas in your pipelines and your name is Texas. But other than that...
True. Fair point. But so the problem there is if solar and wind make up a small percentage of your grid, it usually doesn't really matter because your other power sources that are responsive will pick up the slack in, say, peak demand times when solar and wind aren't, particularly cooperating. And therefore, they're very efficient when there's a small percentage of the grid. As they become a larger and larger percent of the grid, you don't have other sources to pick up the slack when solar and wind aren't cooperating, and therefore they become less and less efficient. You need more and more excess capacity, and that brings us into the fundamental problem with something like solar or wind. If you were going to theoretically replace your entire grid with solar or wind, if you don't want consistent brownouts or blackouts, you would need to figure out a storage buffer, so that when you get a large decrease naturally in solar or wind production, you could run on the storage, and then when they start pumping full blast again, you can recruit your storage and so forth. So you need some sort of probably day, or I don't know the actual amount of time that they've deemed safe for a grid, but you need a couple of days or so worth of energy storage. And the current storage capacity of the grid is next to zero, essentially. Like if the power goes out, there's no storage capacity essentially in the grid. So you either need to build storage.
There's the existing technology is almost all for nuclear plants, and it's hydro batteries currently. But yes, it's very little.
Yeah, it's not a significant portion, it's nowhere close to what would be needed. So you either need to expand grid storage capacity massively, or you need to have a responsive power source as at least a significant part of your grid in order to keep solar and wind viable as probably a minority. Like you'd have to keep solar and wind at a minority of your grid capacity if you don't want to build large storage.
With that, I did find one study that directly approached this, although they only looked at 4 American states: Arizona, Iowa, Massachusetts, and Texas. So I don't know how applicable this was, and I'm not an expert on the economics of energy, so I don't know how accurate it was, but their claims were that energy storage capacity would have to be $20 per kilowatt hour for base load power, which is, for comparison, like we're probably around $200 per kilowatt hour, so it'd have to be 10 times cheaper than it is now to have a renewable grid. But some way, shape, or form, they did an equation where renewables were capable of meeting demand 95% of the time, not 100% of the time, and they had enough other alternative energy to meet demand 5% of the time. That would allow the capacity cost to be $150 per kilowatt hour, so about 7 times less of a drop. Like, that's actually reasonable in the next 10 years to reach $150 a kilowatt hour. So you can, or at least according to this study, it will be possible to have a majority green grid with a minority of anytime power that's available to back it up for a cost-effective future in the near term.
That's an interesting thing. One, I guess, topical point to add to that is you do have to wonder how willing people are going to be to have a vulnerable grid. With Texas's recent run-in with that, you would assume if they're really cutting it on the edge, that might increase, grid vulnerability to, kind of one-off events that could cut your variable. Say if one of your variable rate power generation sources goes out, that your whole grid might really start to fail, right? So it could increase vulnerability. I would assume.
Yeah, it definitely does. But luckily, for everyone that's not a Texan, they're uniquely isolated in terms of their grid. Well,
True.
With the way the other grids in North America are aligned, it's quite unlikely that you'd ever have like a major weather event affect the entire spectrum of the grid, like from British Columbia to California. Like, that's probably going to be significantly different weather at all points throughout history.
Yeah, it would have to be. Yeah, the bigger the grid, no, I would agree. The more resilient, right? So somewhere like Texas or North or South Japan, as we learned, it is going to be more vulnerable just due to that fact. So that it could be a marginal increase in vulnerability for sure, which might not be enough to dissuade people from accepting it, right?
Certainly all location based. Location is so important for all of this stuff, so it's always going to be in any specific area, you'll have to do a new analysis of the viability and what the actual cost will be, which is one of the huge problems you run into looking at estimates for costs for renewables. Yeah,
so that is interesting to hear that we may be a little bit closer on storage viability than I would have thought. I would have thought we're not that close on getting storage capacity that is economically viable, but maybe if it's in the next 10 years, that'll be interesting to see. I mean, certainly storage technology is still rapidly improving, especially with the attention it's getting from EVs, right? Like, electrical vehicles have really put a spotlight on capacity and efficiency for batteries.
Yeah, and I think most people think batteries when they think of storage because of the popularity of EVs. Interestingly, in the recent, probably the last 5 years, the biggest thing I managed to find on storage potential is compressed air. So basically, there's this company in Israel, and they build these tanks underground and cement them in, and when they have excess power, they pump it into the tanks, and when they need power, they pump it out. And they've got about 75% efficiency doing that, which is pretty comparable to the lifetime efficiency of a lithium-ion storage system, and it can last 40 years. And the cost of that is, as I was saying, it costs $150 in these people's estimation for what you want for your storage costs for it to be viable. And the cost for this is somewhere around 180 right now.
And that's really early on, right?
They're in, I guess they've done like proof of concept and everything, and they're now bidding and building large scale storage projects in France and Israel.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Yeah, there definitely is a variety of other storage. I know one interesting one I have heard of is like basically big magnetic spin wheels. Essentially, you just
flywheels of that's like your extremely high initial creation cost comparative to a lot of. I guess all batteries are really high initial creation. But I've seen studies where they estimate you can get up to like 99% storage efficiency, which just blows batteries out of the water.
Yeah, so a very efficient, but yeah, like you said, high initial cost solution. But you when you're talking about grid level storage, you do have a lot more options than something like a car, right? You have the space, you have the fixedness, so you can think outside the box. So I'm hopeful that there will be further storage developments. I don't think that's a question that will come in.
The one I think really demonstrates how local your storage solutions will be is a lot of areas with old mines, like old shaft mines that go down a kilometer or two. You can just put a big weight on that shaft mine, and that shaft mine is now a gravity battery, and that's actually quite cheap to build. But you need the shaft mine to exist. It's obviously not very economical if you have to go dig a 2-kilometer shaft mine. But if it's just sitting there, it might as well be being used for power storage.
Interesting, yeah. Repurpose. I'm sure there's lots of places that could use that. It was fairly common.
Yeah, that is a really interesting idea. It is quite interesting to see how much the battery technology has improved, because same as Hubbard's, I would have thought that the batteries and their viability in terms of holding some power for the renewables would be, would not be feasible at all. But it looks like, there's some serious strides made in this area, so that's actually pretty good to see.
The nice thing with batteries, and this is kind of the opposite of what we've recently been talking about with grid level storage, is that batteries are by far the cheapest and most scalable option for small projects. Because the reason they're not quite viable as grid storage is that you don't really get much of an economy of scale with batteries. Buying 10 battery packs is going to cost you 10 times as much as buying one battery pack. But the fact that you can buy one battery pack, there actually are cities in America right now where businesses buy battery packs to put into their factory or their business or wherever they're burning electricity. And there'll be a 4-hour battery pack that can power that business for 4 hours. And they'll burn that during peak hours so that the electricity cost is the highest at those hours, so they aren't paying that. And then they'll fill those battery packs overnight when the electricity costs are lowest. And in some cities in America, that sort of system pays for itself in 10 years.
Well, this isn't entirely related, but that's actually been proposed for electric vehicle grid integration, where basically the idea is EVs will be, once they're much more common, they'll actually have a somewhat reasonable storage capacity compared to even the grid, right? And what you could do is you could have a smart grid and a smart plug or whatever. And when you plug in your vehicle at home, it draws down during peak hours out of your car, and at off hours, it charges your car back up, right? So you could have it even, and that would also subsidize the EV.
Yeah, because it'd save you money.
Purchase. Yeah, you would be getting the benefit yourself as an EV owner out of that price difference to subsidize your EV cost, right? So that would be I didn't look at how much of a percentage of storage that could feasibly make up, but I mean, it's an interesting addition to the
Mm-hmm.
conversation that, yeah, even as a individual household, you could be doing that.
Well, and if you just do the back of the envelope math, driving 100 miles on an EV is close to the energy consumption of a home for a day. So if you've got an EV that can drive 100 miles, you've got a battery that can come close to the consumption of a home for a day.
Yeah, fairly. If I remember the kilowatt hour consumption and the kilowatt hour capacity of kind of the longer range batteries, it's in the same neighborhood. So that's actually, yeah, that's a good point. How much? I guess the complication there is being how much of it could you drain during peak hours, and how much could you charge during off hours? I guess is another question, and how much wear and tear are you willing to put on your battery? I guess as well. Although again, as the batteries get better and last longer, that might be a less and less of a concern, because I know that battery longevity has increased as well for EVs. So,
yeah.
That being said, I think it seems storage may be part of the solution, but I know that we all had thoughts on nuclear going into this. Do either of you want to start off with nuclear and your thoughts on whether or not that plays a part in the future of the power generation?
Yeah.
Well, one thing I want to say specifically about nuclear, while we're directly transitioning on economics, is that if you ever see a price quote levelized cost on nuclear and it's high, it's almost always because they levelize the cost over 20 years, because 20 years is about the time frame for a wind farm or a solar farm. But a nuclear plant lasts 60 to 80 years. So that is basically the definition of fake news when they do levelized costs over 20 years for nuclear plants.
Yeah, so that would actually play directly into some of the research that I'd been doing, because I'm pretty sure that is exactly what a couple of the sources I found, because some of the nuclear sources I found were pretty cheap. Like one of the cheap sources, not cheap, but one of the sources that I found was pretty favorable to nuclear, but that was the American government, or it was the, give me a second, I need to make sure I get this right. But it was written in tandem with the Nuclear Energy Council, but it was also done with, it was like one of the major, it was one of the major global energy conglomerates, like the research councils as well. But one of the things that I noticed with nuclear from all that, while I track this goddamn thing down, retrofitting is like a really cheap thing to do. So because a lot of these plants they're slated to last for about like 50 years or so, one of the cheapest things that you can do in terms of making sure that you keep generating more power carbon free, or like lowest carbon you can, is retrofit the nuclear plants to make them last another 10 to 20 years, and it's dirt cheap. It's like it's a lot cheaper than any of the other sources, just because you already have the whole thing built. Nuclear power, like the material required to actually run a plant, is really cheap as well. So you might as, like, if you can retrofit it without it being like a safety concern, which is not really, like, American and Canadian nuclear plants are not an issue. So if you can do that, then it's probably one of the best ideas that you can have in terms of dealing with carbon emissions. So I found it here. It's the International Energy Agency. So this is I think it's a branch of the UN actually. But they wrote it in conjunction with the Nuclear Energy Agency, which is but another UN panel. So these are not random small think tanks or something like that producing it. So this report was pretty well structured and pretty well researched. And the other thing that I noticed too with nuclear is a lot of the testing is done or costing, I should say, is done with discount rates, and you can get pretty big differences if you use different discount rates. And nuclear, if you have a higher, like a 3% discount rate versus a 10% discount rate, well, it doesn't sound like a lot. It actually makes a huge difference when you have a massive capital cost. Hubbard, you were saying this earlier, and one of this report that I was going through, even nuclear with the 10% discount rate is still pretty good compared to even things like solar and whatnot, but it definitely makes it a little bit less. It's definitely a lot more expensive if you're dealing with a higher discount rate. But the thing is, when you're dealing with low discount rate will come when your country is stable and has ready access to capital markets. So places like the United States and Canada, they're usually going to have lower discount rates because that's just the economic reality for these countries. And so when you run a discount rate for nuclear, or when you run the discount rate for 3%, it's, everything shrinks down. But nuclear just becomes one of the best options. You're looking the LCOE, its median is $45 USD per megawatt, and that's building a brand new plant. And then if you're doing the nuclear, extending the life, it's $30 USD. And if you look at things like solar or wind, those are 66, 45. It depends on the types of solar and on the types, but a lot of it is a lot higher. There's there's a couple ones that are a bit better, but hydro is pretty good. So the bigger hydro river dams are also really good. But overall, from the research that I could find, is a really careful analysis. One of the most careful ones I could find really showed that nuclear, even if you got to build a brand new plant, it's pretty goddamn it's pretty effective. And then there's always all the other concerns that get brought up about all sorts of things. But one of the most interesting things I've noticed is the most hardcore of the hardcore climate activists that are pretty still within the realm of reason. They're, they haven't gone completely bananas and are, barricading offices and stuff like that. What's that group in the UK, Extinction Rebellion, who've kind of lost their minds. But even the pretty hardcore left-leaning ones, I've noticed that a number of them have flipped to nuclear. That's what they want. So there was a really hardcore one, Zion Lights is her name. She was going all over the world trying to push for she was trying her best to push for all these renewables, and now she wound up switching to nuclear and now works with one of the nuclear agencies to push this, she's not the only one. I've noticed a number of them. They once they actually dig deep into the numbers and into the impacts of other renewables like low carbon emitters, they all seem a lot of them just seem to switch over to nuclear as the number one choice. I found that interesting.
In that exact vein, I also found an article on Bill Gates, or by Bill Gates, an interview with him about his new book, and he just has the biggest heart on for nuclear. He loves nuclear. He thinks it's the only solution, and he's heavily invested into nuclear technology.
Well, now you've lost the left and the right. Congratulations. The other point to make about nuclear is just in terms of the real world application. Places that do use a lot of nuclear seem to have good outcomes, I guess, is the point I would make. Is you can look at the projected costs all day long, but those are, again, so many variables go into them and so many estimates, and it is, I also think, instructive to look at places who have adopted a lot of nuclear use, such as France, and they do seem to have pretty low power costs. France hasn't, as far as I know, had any major nuclear incidents, and very reliable, strong grids. So, yeah, I do think it is interesting that there's definitely examples already in the world of countries that have heavily adopted nuclear with great results. And I don't see the only argument that people seem to be able, and it is obviously a gripping and worth considering argument, is just the danger of a nuclear meltdown. But I think that's where, when you do dive deep into it a little bit more, the risks of, especially the newer technology, is fairly minimal. Like, one of the problems that have happened with nuclear were because of not considered not safe designs. And I think Fukushima was a very old design that was recommended to be decommissioned, and they had just kind of kept it limping along despite recommendations to the contrary.
It had also been built against some recommendations. Like, they put the backup generators, the diesel generators, down in the basement, and I'm pretty sure they were told not to do that, and they did it anyways, because like when you do that, and there's a flood, you knock out the diesel generators, and then you can't keep the thing going. And that's what caused that was one of the critical things that caused the meltdown. And apparently it had been already noted that was a bad call.
Well, and this is where the world actually needs more Canada, because Canadian nuclear reactors are by far the safest nuclear reactors in the world, because they use heavy water. They use heavy water, so they can't have the sort of runaway meltdown that occurred at Fukushima, because in a worst case scenario, they don't require power to continue cooling the reactor.
Yeah.
And they don't require enriched uranium, which means that they can not only burn regular uranium without having to enrich it, so their waste is not nearly as bad. It's just a little less radioactive version of what was mined out of the ground in the first place. But they can even burn nuclear waste from other facilities that burn enriched uranium. And the secret of nuclear power, like the reason it exists at all, basically, is because the US, and probably to a lesser extent Russia, want an excuse to enrich tons of uranium to make bombs and get economies of scale going, so that they could make their nuclear bombs cheaper. So everyone uses enriched uranium power plants except Canada and India, because India gets it. But
the other thing is
there's no actual reason behind all these enriched uranium power plants, which are just fundamentally more dangerous. Like, it's hard to 99% of people don't know the distinguish between light water and heavy water power plants, and heavy water are just a lot safer.
Whoa! Are you telling me that the average person doesn't understand nuclear science?
One of the craziest things to me is that, I think we talked about this before at some point, but after the Fukushima meltdown, Germany decided to switch to different types of
to coal.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to switch to other. There's a couple points here I wanted to make in terms of nuclear power. So Germany is actually a pretty big nuclear power user until Fukushima, and then their populace panicked and wanted them shut down. So they started switching over to other forms of green energy, but as a stopgap, they've had to go pretty crazy in coal. So that's just a big fuck up. But one of the craziest things I read from that is it kills an additional 4,000 people a year, I think it is, in Germany from bad air pollution due to the shutdown of these nuclear plants, because you have to start pumping out coal particulate matter. And of course, that bad air quality is a problem. And I can't remember who the source was, but it was a very reliable governmental look into this. And they were like, holy shit, like an extra 4,000 people die a year because of this. It's like, well, nuclear has a bad rep, but it's just because people are just woefully ignorant of it.
Well, the one human interest story I remember revolving around that in about the year Fukushima happened, when they started switching to coal, and they needed to procure more coal in Germany to be more energy self-sufficient. So Canada has mountaintop removal coal mining, where you take off the top of the mountain wholesale, and that's just disgusting, ruins the environment. Germany, they don't have the same type of coal. They have village removal coal mining, where they just bulldozed a village and dug down a couple meters from where the village was, because that's where the coal is. It was so funny that I don't know if they won the challenge in court, the villagers, but it was a couple hundred villagers, and basically the government said, your land is needed for coal.
Yeah, I mean, that is a general kind of point, is people, I don't think, obviously are capable of objectively weighting the risks, right? Because the nuclear risks are much more visible, they're obviously going to weight them higher than, the coal deaths, which are invisible, right? It's impossible to clearly link, air quality decline and the subsequent deaths to the coal generation. Is just not it's not as a clear salient example, and therefore people just don't weight it in their minds heavily, right, at all.
And with that, I think another point that where people don't see it is that hydro is definitely, throughout its history, hydroelectric production is much more dangerous than nuclear. But a normal person can understand that a Chinese hydroelectric dam is probably not engineered and built to the same standards as a Canadian hydroelectric dam. So when that bursts and kills 500,000 people or whatever it did,
I think it was 250, 275, which is
so
the worst engineering disaster of all time.
Died in China because a hydroelectric dam burst. And to be fair, they covered it up for 10 or 20 years, but nobody looks at that and reasonably says, oh, well, we can't build a hydroelectric dam in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. That's such a good point, because it's like when you would never take a look at a catastrophe like that and think, well, we should just shut down all of the dams in Canada, and because you'd be able to look at, I would say, a lot of the different things that we do in Canada, and you're going to be able to find examples throughout the world of just complete and utter cock-ups that caused a ton of death over it because it was done by, a pile of idiots. And nuclear is no different, right? But I think it's just one of those things that's very captive, because it's, you get the mushroom cloud, and then you get the day after that movie and all that, right? Like, that's what people think, right? So that they are not thinking clearly about it. It's the same thing with terrorism, right? Where it just captures the imagination so much more intensely. And even though, car deaths are way more brutal than terrorism, people are absolutely, willing to throw all their rights away in terms of, like, the Patriot Act over that, but they're not willing to, look at, even
wear a seatbelt,
or even, deal with the consequences of overeating, right?
Yeah, I think there's probably a correlation between people who were cheering in the Patriot Act under Bush and people who don't wear seatbelts.
Got it.
And the same people who now bitch about masks.
Well, that is taking your freedom away. Like, if you have to wear a mask in public, that's the end of the world. But if you get, gulagged off to some random place with no lawyer because of the Patriot Act, that's, fair game. I think nuclear is just, has a terrible PR problem and should be much more prominent in the conversation for solving our energy needs. And I think one thing to consider too is some climate activists say that we need carbon capture, on top of going, carbon neutral. On top of that, we're going to need at some point to carbon capture to reverse climate change. That's another argument that's made. Well, if you want any hope of capacity at that level, you'd have to think nuclear then comes into the conversation. Like, it seems a bit tall enough a task without nuclear to overhaul the current grid. But if you're telling me that we're going to need to increase grid capacity above and beyond what it is now for a large chunk of power generation going to carbon capture, it just doesn't seem possible without putting nuclear back on the table
Yeah.
in large quantity.
Well, people forget about this, right? Where it's like when you burn fossil fuels, you're releasing energy. And to be able to recapture that, like, so a chemical reaction has occurred, which produced energy, which then, pushed your car along the road or span the turbines in your power plant. In order to then put that carbon back into a state where it's now no longer in the atmosphere, that requires energy. Like it requires some form of energy. It's thermodynamics. So you can't just do carbon capture for free. It doesn't work that way. So you're going to have to figure that one out.
I personally planted a tree, so checkmate.
Well, there you go.
And
Thank
you
you
didn't
for
consume
saving the
any
world.
energy in your tree planting endeavors, thankfully. You were net calorie zero. You didn't drive to your tree planting endeavor. You didn't do anything.
Yeah.
It was just, you used your mind.
Just a tree appeared, and it started capturing carbon.
Yeah. So, yeah, I can't see a way around nuclear personally, but I mean, maybe if storage technology takes off and in concert with even better solar and better wind technologies, but
I can see one way around nuclear, and that is hydrogen power plants, which are like just not on really anybody's radar.
Yeah,
But how
until you mentioned them, I had no clue. Like, I'm pretty goddamn ignorant, but
how are you going to generate the hydrogen? That's my question.
So right now, the hydrogen power plants that are getting built in the States are going to use a natural gas hydrogen blend, and they're going to up the hydrogen in the blend over the years. Basically the same sort of idea as a car with ethanol in the gasoline. So the generation at the moment in two of the plants is going to be from solar panels. Like, they're going to have a solar farm to create hydrogen to put into their natural gas plant. And then the third plant is going to be taking free waste hydrogen from an industrial process that's happening like a few blocks away and adding that to their natural gas.
Fair enough, but I guess I don't know it well enough, but it seems to me that there wouldn't be enough just free hydrogen available to make that a significant part of the...
separate it, wouldn't you?
No, this isn't a short-term thing, because right now the best way to make hydrogen is to burn natural gas to make hydrogen, which obviously is not the greenest thing to do. But you can make hydrogen through electrolysis, which I believe is somewhere in the range of 50 to 60% energy efficient. So what's often in the discussion in batteries and energy storage is the efficiency. So lithium ion over its lifetime on the grid will be 75% efficient. Same with that compressed air. The pumped hydro stations, so basically an artificial dam where you just pump water up when it's extra electricity and let it down when you need electricity, that can be around 80%. So 60% is not fantastic. But the nice thing is that effectively you can retrofit existing natural gas plants simply by changing the turbine to be able to burn this.
But it's essentially just indirect storage capacity at that point, right? Because you're having to use some initial power source to do the hydrolysis to get the hydrogen. You're going to have to use...
it becomes a cheap storage method.
Yeah,
Yes.
It's just like
but if you want to increase overall, what I'm talking about is if you want to increase overall capacity and overall actual output, that's actually just a step in the wrong direction, because you have that 60% efficiency step where you lose 40% of your power. I'm talking about, say in 50 years, if we want to do large scale carbon scrubbing, we might need a grid that produces 50% more power than right now, or 50% more power than otherwise would have been needed if we're not going to do carbon dioxide scrubbing. So all I'm saying is nuclear might be the necessary in combination with other power sources just to get our grid expanded rapidly enough to meet the demand, like the total power demand of a world in which we're doing large scale carbon capture.
Which might become necessary to pump down the numbers of that are
Well,
already
yeah,
in the
and
atmosphere, right? So
that's the contention of, I assume, some climate scientists and as well as significant chunk of climate activists, that will be a necessary process in order to avoid catastrophe. So yeah, again, that will also depend on whether or not you fall in line with that prediction, but that's out of my completely out of my knowledge area whether or not that's a necessary part of
Well, the only thing with, I don't know, I definitely didn't look into the idea of carbon recapture, but the only thing with that I feel like nuclear is a little overkill for is that you don't need your carbon capture stuff to run when the environment's not going, right? Like you can just run it when the sun's shining or the wind's blowing, and otherwise it can just sit there and do nothing. Shouldn't be a big loss.
True, but what I'm mentioning is just in terms of viability of it scaling the grid fast enough. If you leave nuclear off the table completely, I don't know if that grid scaling is going to be viable.
Yeah,
If you take one tool out of the tool belt, that's obviously going to hurt your ability to scale up as quickly, and that might not be a tool we can afford to take off the table. Is all I'm saying.
I think nuclear is, just from what I've done research on, it's pretty. I think there's, unless barring some sort of massive breakthrough in another place, you're gonna have to go nuclear, especially since one of the things I would say that maybe we could touch on a bit is just like the sheer scale of trying to do everything by wind and solar. Like one of the things I came across is just when you're trying to do that, if you want to do everything wind and solar, you have to eat up huge swaths of land. And that is really hard on the environment, obviously. You're going to destroy massive plots of the local ecology. And that's one of the big arguments against hydro. Like I see a ton of, one of the oddest things is there's a lot of people, especially in BC, who are they're really against hydro, but then they want to use something like wind and solar, and those also have massive broad scale impacts on the ecosystems. I think it's upwards of 400 times the amount of space is required to produce the equivalent amount of power from a nuclear plant versus a wind farm or a solar farm, and that is such a big difference that you really, if you're talking double or triple or 5 times, it's like, okay, we could probably handle that amount of ecological damage. But in the stuff that I was reading and viewing, they completely annihilate these, especially with like a big solar area. You just destroy everything. Like you scrape all the land, all the dirt off, everything off, because then you have to level everything out, put those things on there, and then you, especially with something like solar, you have to get rid of those solar panels. Have about a 20-year life. It's like nobody talks about where the hell those are going to go, because they don't have great demolishing retirement plans for them yet. I don't think it's going to be impossible to deal with them, but if you have these massive solar fields everywhere, like how are you going to deal with that in 20 years? Like you're going to, especially if you build a huge chunk of them all at once and they're not as staggered out, like that's a massive amount of stuff that you're going to have to waste you're going to have to deal with. And it's probably just going to get shipped over to a nation like India and pollute the hell out of that country, so the Western nations don't have to deal with it and think about it, right?
China and Europe both have solar panel recycling projects going on, but as of yet, if you don't want to throw out into a landfill your solar panels in North America, you need to ship them to China or Europe.
Yeah, it's like that costs a huge amount of money and power, right? Well, and then guess what you're burning to get those damn solar panels over there? Bunker fuel that these big seafaring vessels use. So again, like one of the things I've noticed with doing this research, a lot of people seem to think that you can just toss up solar and wind and it's Gucci. It's like, well, there's actually a huge amount of external, like other costs and other problems to deal with they're just not even factored in.
Well, and also when people think of the bats,
That actually turns out to be a big problem too.
Well, the bats are wind farms, right?
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, like wind farms are. I mean, solar panels, solar farms. I definitely don't see. Like, I didn't do deep research on this, but intuitively, I don't see them being as bad for the environment as wind farms, because a solar farm is like pretty close to a regular farm. It's a field that is no longer the natural environment, and instead of filling it with wheat or whatever, you fill it with solar panels. But wind farms are going out into untouched wilderness that there's no good reason for humans to ever develop that wilderness except for the fact that it's got good wind there, and just building hundreds or thousands of kilometers of road that disturb the natural habitat and mess things up in some of the areas where things haven't been messed up yet, which I believe Germany and the UK is getting to the point where they basically just built wind farms in all the places where they can build them without screwing up the environment.
That was the other thing I think I ran into in my research is you actually will run out of space, because to actually meet all of the power generation needs, let's just say, stop the, hypothetically, there is no variable power problem, but just to, like, you can't push a wind turbine to generate more power, to make it, 20 times more efficient, because at a certain point it just caps out, just due to like physics. Same with solar power, but particularly wind, you can only have so much space, and if you, like, once that's used up, like, what are you gonna do? And a lot of like the other thing with that.
Well, I think that's a more of a concern in, as Price was mentioning, maybe somewhere like the UK or Germany, where those are tiny countries with relatively large populations, with so they're gonna have large power costs per land. But like somewhere like the US, I just cannot see an argument that the US would run out of land for solar or wind to like haul like that. That just does not seem like that sounds like like just a nonsensical argument. Like the US or Canada, like, for goodness sakes, like, that's just, we could turn Saskatchewan into a solar farm. They're done. Like, there's nothing else there.
The dream.
Like, it's just so, it seems like a nonsensical argument for some countries. Some countries, maybe, yes, more of a reasonable argument could be made for, especially particularly wind, where it seems a very, very location dependent power source compared to solar. But again, so that does come back to the particular grid that you're, like, Europe has like an integrated grid. So are they able to, in that entire grid, get most of their power from, say, wind and solar, depending on where they build it? Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to say. Could the US? I would say almost certainly. Just doesn't seem like realistic that they wouldn't be. Could Russia? Could Canada? Probably. Could India? Maybe not. Like, so.
It's very like place dependent, right? Like that's the other thing, is a lot of this stuff really depends on where you are in your local environment, the type of sun, or like the amount of sun you get, all that stuff, right? So yeah, 100% I agree with that. But my point is, for certain places, like those demanding, all wind and solar, it's just like you can't do it for some places. Like, it's just not possible.
Well, I think, yeah, I might agree to that. I would just say taking any tool out of the toolkit just seems dumb at this point, right? Like, even the idea that you would say put a moratorium on any hydrocarbon-based power. Well, if that just seems like a dumb policy, because then you could potentially be stopping the development of, say, a highly efficient natural gas plant that's replacing some outdated coal plant.
I am
yeah,
a pretty huge fan of getting rid of coal, though. I think that one is.
yeah. So, but again, like that's, and then, maybe making a moratorium on coal might actually be viable, but taking tools out of the tool belt just doesn't seem like a good idea at this point. So if you can replace coal with natural gas, why not? Like if it's between leaving the coal in place and bringing in natural gas, and I think that's going to be very salient for developing countries that might not have the luxury of, say, going towards just wind or solar, right? They might just they might not even have the technical expertise to set up their grid with those power sources.
The Chinese and Japanese, I believe, are expanding a lot of grids around the world with additional coal plants because they have some of the world's leading experts. I just think that's one of the funniest things. But in the future, like China's really pushing on the solar. In the future, you'll be able to just mortgage your country and get a solar grid from China.
Well, like I would like places like, China and the Mongolian desert. That's where you're gonna throw up. They're thinking. I think they are building right now a huge solar farm there, and it's gonna just a massive one. And a place like that where you're really not gonna disturb much of the environment because it's just literally the desert that has nothing going on. Like that, you're gonna disrupt nearly as badly as somewhere like a much richer ecosystem place like Canada, where
wow,
I guess you would have to be careful of damaging certain parts of it, but you could probably do it in a lot safer of a method than something in a place like where there's a lot more to lose in terms of the ecology.
Well, I mean, I just don't think solar does take up a lot more room than nuclear, but I think you're underestimating just how small nuclear's footprint is compared to
That's true.
Anything else. Like it's much smaller, even in terms of size, than equivalent internal combustion, I believe. With solar, the other thing is that we aren't even close to the theoretical limit, which I believe is around 60% efficiency, which could have the size in the future. Like right now, most solar installations are between 18 and 21% efficiency of the panels they're using. And then commercially, there's access to 30% efficient panels, but they're not as cost efficient at a plant scale yet, on a farm scale. And hopefully we'll keep having breakthroughs in solar efficiency past that. So solar is getting a smaller footprint as it goes along as well, which makes it more viable to put on urban areas and in urban areas, which doesn't have the sort of negative environmental effects that it could take away in other situations. There's even a solar road in France that was a complete catastrophe, but it's just such a funny idea, and that they actually did it, and it did generate electricity. It just cost way too much money.
I remember actually seeing that, I think in Popular Mechanics or something, a long time ago.
Yeah, it's there are a lot of potential solutions if you're talking switching the whole grid over, because that's quite a ways away, even if it were to happen.
Yep, I don't got anything to add there.
Yeah. Was there anything else that you guys wanted to cover in terms of just, the viability of renewables at all?
Oh, the one thing I think is super interesting in terms of storage, that it won't scale fast enough for the sort of time frames we're talking about, but in 20 years or so, you'll really start to see it, where used car batteries, so about 1 million miles into using your Tesla or your GM or so, they're supposed to have 80% of their charge capacity left, and that's probably when people want to start replacing them. So you'll have an 80% charge capacity battery, and then the obvious move for that is to cycle that into a grid level battery. So some grid energy provider buys that battery off you, you go buy a new one with 100% charge, and they plug that into their huge battery packs.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
actually pretty interesting. I think that would prove to be
that
really
that
useful.
will.
'Cause, yeah, why throw out a battery that's got 80% charge? If it has 10%, maybe it's not going to be quite as effective. But
Yeah, so like once EVs become a big thing, then that industry will exist, and it's an interesting thing to keep in mind.
yeah, I have one other thing that I kind of touched on a little bit is just like when it comes to viability of um renewable energy when compared to the costs of fossil fuels. One of the big issues that keeps getting brought up is fossil fuel subsidies. So Biden's already kind of tackled this, but in the states in particular, there's a lot of old laws baked into the congressionally passed laws and most of them are tax laws. So there's a lot of tax breaks in the states for fossil fuels, and they are actually worth a ton of money. Estimates range up to like something like 500 billion in the United States just directly. And there's also some other rules. So one of the things is like they can use last in first out accounting method for the inventory, which actually saves them quite a bit in taxes because you use you can deduct your expensive stuff first, and that's been banned by all of the global accounting standards and whatnot, but they're still allowed to use it. And so there's quite a bit of baked in incentives for these companies that actually, well, like, because a lot of people there, like the comments are like, well, it's not, fossil fuels are just cheaper, so you don't want to raise up the prices without, you're just gonna you're gonna damage the economy. And like these subsidies made a lot of sense back in the day, right? Like that's why they were passed, is because the United States really wanted their energy cheap so that they would stimulate a bunch of economic growth, and it worked really well. And so, and this started in like the 50s, I think, but so it's not something you can just sit around and complain about that why did it exist at all in the first place. But it got baked in. These companies now are extremely powerful, so it's really hard to get them out. But if you did get them out, you would actually see, I would think, quite a big shift towards renewables in general, just because if you're wiping out hundreds of billions of dollars worth of subsidies, and they think in some estimates it's trillions of dollars in subsidies across the whole globe. That is, and in developing countries, you're going to have to keep those around, but for the developed economically Western nations, this is something that would probably push the balance even further towards renewables. So it's good to see, at least in my opinion, it's good to see Biden taking an actual shot at that, because so long as those stay around, and same with people like Gabbard, so long as those stay around, it'll always be more difficult for the green sources to compete.
Well, and I think that on the flip side, that's a decent argument for carbon tax, right? Or cap and trade, or combination, where it just makes sense to try to fully reflect the actual cost of, fossil fuels by having a carbon tax. And I mean, you can argue about the specifics, but I think most people could understand that, the pollution from burning fossil fuels, especially, and the carbon pollution, there should be some costs included there. There should be something economically that disincentivizes that, right? Compared to sources of energy that don't have that downside. It just makes sense. That's basic economics, that you address externalities. So yeah, it really does need to go hand in hand with a tapering off of these subsidies, just to make sure that you're actually truly reflecting the costs of carbon sources of energy as they are today. otherwise, yeah, it's just going to slow the rate of adoption of alternative sources for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You have to bake those externalities in, otherwise, if you don't deal with the incentives, like nothing gets done, right? So, like we are slowly seeing like governments waking up to that, which is good. But who was it? It was Elon Musk in his last interview on Joe Rogan. He was talking to the incoming Biden administration about like a carbon tax, and they're like, no, that's too politically difficult, so we're not going to touch that. And like I can see that being politically difficult, but I thought that was interesting that maybe there's going to be a bunch of banging of the desk and whatnot from the Biden administration, but the actual shit won't get done. Who knows? But yeah, I do think you're going to have both sides of that coin dealt with. Otherwise, we're not going to see like progress in this situation.
It'll be slow progress.
Yeah, exactly.
Progress nonetheless, but again, even if you believe, the kind of middle of the road estimates on, say, something like climate change, we need much quicker action. So you can't afford to, take it slow and steady on that front. You kind of have to force the issue. And I mean, if you're sitting around still listening to this podcast and you don't believe in climate change at all, I mean, worst case scenario is the air's clean. So
yeah, exactly.
Biggest downside of going to renewable, sustainable sources of energy like wind and solar, it's like, oh no, we massively reduced air pollution in general. Like even if it doesn't help climate change, because that's not a thing.
I will make a bit of a point here, though, because so in this research, I came across a couple papers, and this is, I think, some of the concern with the whole climate change. There is some segment of the climate activists and scientists who their solution is degrowth, like legitimately degrowing the economy. And that is where I think you get a lot of the pushback where people think like, oh, okay, so I have to now live with less and go down in my material standards to save the planet. Go fuck yourself. I'm not doing that. And I think it's completely viable to get there through changes in the way that, in technology. Like I do think that is completely doable without taking a hit there. But there is at least a relatively, I don't know how big the segment it is, but I was running into these papers that were saying, yeah, like the solution is degrowth. And it's like, okay, well, that has to be dealt with, I think, like that has to be contended with, because there's a group of people who are saying this. So, and if, that if you're telling people, well, you're going to get paid less and you're going to be able to afford less stuff, like they're just not going to go for it.
Well, I think, but again, like I don't think that degrowth or whatever is coupled to renewable energy, right? Like it's not necessarily coupled to it. Like
no, it's not.
We've seen that you could have renewable, zero emissions energy sources completely replace current capacity. That's not really a question. It's the only question is, are we willing to do it, and are we willing to like spend the money on it, et cetera, et cetera. But it's technically viable, I guess. So you don't have to couple those two concepts. I mean, yeah, I think there is a chunk of the climate activists and climate science that has a very pessimistic attitude. But even then, like you don't have to agree with them, and it still makes sense to take action on renewables.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Do you guys have anything else?
Yeah, I'm pretty much done with talking.
Alrighty.
Yeah,
I am too.
Same. The main thing, like my takeaway from all this, is basically to sum up the renewable energy idea is that right now building new power should all be renewable. That just makes sense. But I don't think we're quite at the point where replacing all of our existing power with renewables makes sense outside of nuclear, which is, I guess, sustainable. So that's where the incentive structures come in to make that get here quicker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was kind of my takeaway with this too, where it's, the renewables are definitely viable. They're not going to be the thing that takes over. Everything's not going to be generated with them. You're going to need, like Hubbard said, you can't take stuff off the table, and you're gonna have to use a broad toolkit, and if you do that, it's completely doable. But they are here. They are actually becoming very competitive. It's not like 40 years ago or anything like that. The technology, especially in the last 10 years, has become pretty crazy. Like just how much it's dropped. So for solar, especially. But yeah, I think the solutions are right there in front of us, and I think actually if you were being wise about it, you could do it without you could do it without sacrificing a bunch of growth or anything like that. You could do it without damaging the economy. It's a completely doable thing. But yeah, that's it for me.
All right.
All right.
Well, let's call it. Peace.
Peace.
Peace.